My name is David Pluviose, and we're just so pleased to have as our guest Dr. Larry Johnson, who is president of Guttman Community College. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for taking some time to join us here for In the Margins. And of course, as I look at your background and some of the things that you have been working on at Guttman Community College, we understand that the work that you're doing for our underrepresented populations is just so vital. Coming out of the pandemic, we know that so many community colleges have struggled with enrollment. So many of our students have struggled with even the prospect of whether a higher education is for them. And I know that you've been front and center in some of these issues. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit off the top about your own journey in higher education. And I was wondering if you could speak about when you first became interested in higher education administration in particular.
Awesome. Thank you so much, David. And it's such a pleasure to be here with On the Margins. And it's such an incredible topic and certainly a timely topic to be able to share with the audience about. So I am in my going on 20 years serving in higher education, primarily in the community and technical college network or ecosystem, if you will, hailed from Belgrade, Florida, which is Palm Beach County. And that is a community where, like many of the students that we serve, where there are health disparities, where a disproportionate number of our students are impacted by low socioeconomic status, access to education may not be as, I would say, as advantageous in terms of students being equipped with all of the resources. So you're coming from a community of 10,000 people, and you wonder, what is it that you can do with that type of background? How do you overcome some of those barriers of food and housing insecurities that you've experienced seeing many of the communities from your hometown? And then I think that for me was really the catalyst for thinking about not only higher education, but education. At the time, I did not see many men of color who were English teachers. So I established that, hey, I will become an English teacher so that I can give back, so that I can be a role model. And after attending Florida A&M University or FAMU, I then began to awaken to think about, well, is there another way in which I can make an impact? And I had taken a community college course as a dual enrollment student, did not think at the time it would become my career. But as I moved forward to Florida State, I then discovered through an adjunct opportunity that while I wanted to impact the lives of young people of color as an English teacher, I can do that at the community college because many of the students who were Black and brown were attending the community colleges. And national data shows that oftentimes students who have graduated from four-year colleges and universities, an overwhelming number of them started at the community college. So I saw that then as an opportunity for me to be able to still transform the minds of young people as they entered the community college setting. And then the journey began. I began to think about, well, as a faculty member, I could do so much. There was much I can do in terms of classroom research. I can, create experiential learning opportunities for them. But truly, in order to make the impact where our young people can be seen and heard, and our older adults, because we offer educational opportunities to not only the traditional, but the non-traditional population as well, I discovered that we needed people at the table. We needed people at the table who would advocate for what I oftentimes will say, the least of these. And I felt that it was incumbent upon me to begin to seek out the opportunities that would allow me to be at the table, to be the voice for many of those students who were voiceless. So that became my journey from growing up in a very small town in Belgrade, seeing the lack of resources, experiencing many of the obstacles that we read about in literature. And I use that as the driving force of the reinforcement to really bettering myself and giving back to my community in the way in which I've done now as a faculty member and as a higher ed administrator now in New York City.
Coming to the present, these last couple of years have been challenging on a number of levels. And if you look across the higher education landscape, the community college segment in particular was most impacted nationally when it comes to enrollment, right? Because of course, as you know, many of the students who are considering a community college, they didn't necessarily have, and we talk about this a lot, they didn't have the study space at home when, everything was shut down. We talk about the digital divide, which impacted community college students, disproportionately in many cases, especially during this pandemic, didn't really see college as an option. They had to work to support their families. And so there's been a lot of work nationally in the community college landscape to really boost enrollment, invite some of these students back, reach out and see what they can do to attract more students. I was wondering if you could talk about the experience leading Guttman through pandemic. I know that if I'm not mistaken, you may have come in the midst of the pandemic, if I'm not mistaken. And I was wondering if you could talk about the experience leading that institution at such a time of such kind of shifting stands and instability. So I wonder if you reflect on that experience and how you have been able, as we have, progressed, to really reach out to students to let them know about all the opportunities that they could avail themselves of at Guttman.
No, thank you. And this was probably one of the most, I would say, difficult times to transition to a new presidency. The process was much different. I was afforded the opportunity to arrive to Guttman, but the process was mostly remote. There was no coming to campus for what we traditionally know as open forums and meeting with students, meeting with faculty. That was through the lens of Zoom and through Teams. So it was definitely a different process, but the preparation and the unwavering, I would say, desire to make a difference at a college like Guttman Community College that already had a storied past of 9 years at the time of remarkable outcomes, graduation rates exceeding 45% compared to other, New York State and nationwide institutions nationwide in terms of community colleges. That was really the catalyst for me. So I'll back up and go back to Phoenix, because I was at Phoenix and I was there at Phoenix College when we actually had to implement many procedures to support students. And you identify one of those, and that was leading the college where a population of students who were under-resourced. The digital divide was critically important because our students, while we said, okay, we'll give every student a laptop, but what we did not anticipate at the time is that many of those students who we gave a laptop to did not have access to the internet, so that they can actually complete the work, because we were now working within these our online learning management systems. So for me, it was around, okay, how do we really respond to that moment? So at Phoenix College, one of the things I did was bring together my team to talk about how do we respond? What is it that we need to do? So in working not only internally, but externally with elected officials in the city, we decided that we wanted to solve the digital divide. So in working with our K through 12 partners, Phoenix Union School District at the time, we thought that we would do a pilot program where we would place satellites throughout select areas throughout the community, so that the young people in K through 12 system and our community college students will have access at different points throughout the city where the college was located, so that they can complete their work. Because I saw that as a moral imperative. We can't say that we are providing educational opportunities and access if we're truly not providing access. So that became one of the, I would say, responses to the pandemic that was important. But also the food insecurity was also another area. Our students had grown accustomed to coming on campus for, the different food items that oftentimes we'll have once a week, fresh items from, different organizations that would come. So how do we now still provide that access to our students? So at Phoenix College, we still were able to allow students to come on campus to receive the items that they needed, so that they can, again, be able to take care of themselves throughout this period of time where the campus was closed down. So, and those were the practices that I brought with me from Phoenix College to now Guttman Community College. And Guttman, as I came in 21, we were somewhat, I say, coming out of what was the beginning of a very tragic and a time of significant loss, but now figuring out how can we now return to campus in a way that was safe, in a way in which we can ensure that the campus was conducive to learning. So in working with faculty and staff, again, I took that same approach of convening our teams to begin to think about all aspects of the student experience holistically. What type of resources do our students need? What type of services do they need access to? And we did a wonderful job, even prior to my arrival, of making sure that students could still come on campus and receive those food items that they needed. And we did also provide the laptop access to students as well. So I believe for me, when I think about, the pandemic and even, on the other side of that, where we're still trying to figure out what this new reality would be, for me, it was always the equity lens, in terms of how can you apply an equity lens to make sure that the students who were struggling already, who did not have the resources, how can you close that gap? The laptops was one, providing continued food services was one, reaching out to students to make sure they were morally well, providing that emotional well-being and access to counseling was still critically important. And those are some of the practices that have helped us, I believe, to now begin to think about how do we now approach enrollment differently, but not only enrollment, how do we ensure that we have the right mixture of academic programs that will ensure that students, once they complete at the community college, that they are able to move on to a career, if that is their desire, and most importantly, make a family sustaining wage, or to transition to for your colleges and universities where they're not losing credits, but those credits will allow them to begin as a junior. So it's still some of the same issues that we've struggled with prior to the pandemic, but I think now that we're on the other side of 2020, I think it's causing community colleges to really reimagine how we can better serve students and support them in a way in which we can truly be equity focused.
I was wondering if you could talk about, some of the differences. You, of course, serve at a community college in a major metropolis. And so, but of course, we have many of our community colleges across the country are serving, for instance, in rural areas where transportation is an issue, whereas in New York City, perhaps easier to get around. I was wondering if you could reflect on the unique challenges of serving the students within New York, as opposed to some of what some other community college leaders are dealing with in different settings. And I just wanted to, if you could reflect on what is unique about serving in New York versus other places that you have either taught or been an administrator at. So I wonder if you could reflect on that a little bit.
Yeah, when I think about, serving in New York and Guttman Community College, if I didn't mention it before, we are one of 25 institutions within the City University of New York. Our CUNY serves about 500,000 students, of which about 200,000 of them are seeking baccalaureate degrees or degrees in general. We have a large, because of the nature of our 7 community colleges, those non-credit programs as well that lead to different certifications. So what's so interesting about New York City that I never thought that I would encounter is that I was so accustomed to driving to campus, seeing students drive to campus, right? Depending on the region, being at a comprehensive college campus where we have 4 or 5 buildings, to now come to New York and we're in this vertical building. Everything happens within 6 or 7 floors if you're in the midtown or if you're within the city. So to now work with students who are taking the train. The train is really how most students get to campus. But the unique part about it was that the mode of transportation, but the access and success has not waned, in that the university and our college in particular has invested in ensuring that students have the metro cards and the transportation cards so that they can get to campus. So while other colleges may struggle with, how will students get to campus? There's no transportation. There may not be, adequate, buses that will allow them to come directly to their, onto the campus. But I think for me, it was really the reality of how students have to navigate the barriers of getting to the college campus, and maybe it may be an hour and a half train ride, but just the commitment and the dedication of this student who will come to us from the Bronx, when it may take them, multiple trains and transfers potentially to get to the campus. So for me, that was a reflection of that. This is truly a student. And when I compare to all of the other campuses that I've worked at, these students are committed to academic attainment because they are braving weather conditions. I mean, it snows, but the snow does not stop, the train system. It does not stop the other modes of transportation. And these students are committed. And I would say for those, those areas that are rural, some of the practices that I've seen is really partnering with the, Department of Transportation. Identify, is there a way to supplement even, providing transportation cars, and providing transportation passes for students at one institution I work with. That's one of the things we did. Every year we partnered, and there was it was supplemented in a way, and we provided students that completed X or were enrolled in X number of credit hours. They were provided those transportation passes so that they can get to campus, thus eliminating that barrier that would have otherwise impacted their ability to be successful. Because even in rural areas, I think that there is still some type of transportation system. And then I think in partnering with local city council persons and city managers and mayors, with whatever the context of that rural town would be, I think it's incumbent, if they're looking to how will they revitalize in some regards, or how would they skill up their community or support the community in terms of workforce development and pipelining students into the programs. I think it's incumbent upon many of those smaller regions with less resources to really think about the investment in terms of resources to make sure persons are able to get to campus to earn those degrees, and then they can give back to their communities.
Many community colleges across the nation, one of the most urgent crises that they face in the last few years was sharp enrollment declines, especially in and around this pandemic. In particular, the community college segment has seen really alarming declines in student enrollment, and so many leaders have been pressed to come up with the best way to promote the value proposition of the community college, right? For many of our Black and Brown students and other students on the margins, the choice that they felt that they had was, working so that families could eat or going to college, right? A lot of times it seemed as if many students did not see both options as viable. Taking care of their kids, working to support their families, and going to college, it had to be one or the other. And many, of course, chose, naturally, working to take care of their families, take care of their kids, thinking that, hey, the pandemic is on, there's too much going on, I cannot go to school. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how, well, first of all, enrollment. I know that you have not been at Guttman long, but talk about how that wave may or may not have affected Guttman. And I was wondering if you could speak about what you have done and are doing to promote the value proposition of a community college.
Yeah, Dave, you mentioned a couple of really good points. The value proposition is number one. We know that when, according to data, when a market is not doing well, we see more students enroll right into community colleges. That's what we thought would happen, but that's not what happened. So we began to see a marked decline in terms of students enrolling into community colleges. And it does go back to the value proposition. What it calls institutions to begin to think about is how are we, or what type of programs do we offer? And are students completing those programs, and are they able to get internships and also able to get jobs that will allow them to have family sustaining wages? So what I think is important is that we have to begin to work closely with our workforce partners. It is not enough to create curriculum in hopes that students will come, in hopes that they will get a job. I think in the creation of programs that lead to work, we have to have employers at the table so that the competencies that they are desiring, that we embed that into the programs, and that their experiential learning where students have access to those organizations, that will increase the likelihood that they will move into those jobs and they will be able to be successful. So I think having business and industry and corporations to help in terms of how we, skill up the workforce has to be a priority of every institution. So like many community colleges, Guttman Community College, it is 10 years old. We're growing. We were somewhat impacted, like most institutions. But for me, it began a conversation around what do we offer now? What practices have we implemented that have served the college well? And how do we need to respond differently to the moment? So how we're responding to the moment is that we worked on an inaugural strategic enrollment management plan. And as we begin to talk about that enrollment plan, we talked about the type of students that we have and the type of students we hope to have moving into the future, and the type of resources that they'll need to be successful. The model that we have is one that is already successful. Students are within their first year, they're full-time. Students have embedded work-based experience. We employ the NACE competencies to ensure that students are gaining all of the skills that employers would like them to have so that they can be ready for the workplace. And we're scaling up and increasing even more the opportunities for them to have internships, and also leaning into apprenticeship programs with corporations that will help students to be successful. So for our college, we're at a place where we don't have years of experience doing work-based workforce type programming, but we're now identifying within the context of our model which of those programs make sense for us. So we're looking at networking and cybersecurity, and not just creating associate of applied science programs that will not lead students to do well and be able to contribute back to their respective communities, but we're looking at the market data to determine, based upon the next 5 or more years, where can we as a community college that is so innovative as Guttman and so nimble as Guttman, how can we ensure and increase that enrollment, but also access for students who would come to us because they see the end in mind. Oftentimes students have come to the community college because it was somewhat a last choice, or it was a choice they made because they didn't get the first offer that they wanted, so they will come and just maybe amass credit hours and then leave, and then the college completion is impacted by that. But through a structured guided pathways, we at Guttman are working closely with students so that they understand within their first year, and even before they commit to the college, we have sessions with them that are called our information sessions, where we orient students to understanding what does it mean to be a Guttman student? What does it mean to be in a cohort model, to be in a structure where you will be meeting with your advisor, we call them success advocates, every week to really make sure that you are acclimating, to make sure that you're doing well in your courses, where we have faculty who are in learning communities where they're talking about how the students are performing and they're modifying their practices that will better support the student. So those are some of the, I would say, reimaginings that we're thinking about. We're building upon the model of success that we already have, but it is truly thinking about the end in mind, that we should be partnering, as I said earlier, with businesses and organizations. And that's what I love about the City University of New York. We're partnering with organizations like the CEO Jobs Council, where organizations are committed to ensuring that students have access to jobs through the partnerships that they have with community colleges, where they are working closely alongside us to make sure that students have those hopefully paid internships, making sure that our curriculum is aligned in a way where students are truly able to demonstrate proficiency so that they can be successful. So I would say we are certainly, as a college and as a system, truly leaning into how can we ensure that students have livable wages if they are completing applied science degrees, and how can we reimagine some of the practices that we've had in the past to make sure that we are marketing ourselves in a way where students will see the value proposition and they will see the ROI once they come to community colleges. They know that they can get a job, and not just for the sake of a financial aid disbursement, not for the sake of just taking a couple of credit hours so that they can transfer. If we employ a guided pathway structure in such a way where students can see the completion, and that completion leads to a job, I believe that will combat much of those narratives that we've heard in the past around the role of the community college students not completing, they're just amassing hours and then leaving. But we have to make sure that they are meeting with employers when they first get there. Doing at some interval of their time or milestone, having employers on campus so that they can meet students. Those are the things I believe that will make a difference in terms of showing students reputable companies that are interested in them.
You've talked some about, workforce training, and it's interesting looking at community college, of course, all of higher education. Community colleges are, we'd say the most nimble institutions. You can think about all models of higher education, in so much that when the workforce comes with a need, and of course, with things changing so fast in this economy, community colleges, of course, and many times are best equipped to respond to urgent workforce needs. And so, of course, I know that you've probably seen that throughout your career. Guttman, of course, as you've mentioned, is relatively young. I think only 10 years or maybe 11 years this year. And so Guttman, even more than most, might be in a position to innovate, to respond to the new economy. It seemed as if, jobs are being created, things are shifting, faster than ever. And so I was wondering if you could talk about what you found at Guttman when it comes to innovation and your vision for Guttman's future. It's a relatively young institution, and that has some advantages in terms of being perhaps more nimble. What did you find at Guttman that was working, and what do you hope to build as you look into the future at Guttman?
I automatically discovered, even in considering, the opportunity, was the innovation of the faculty. I mean, to take the best of practices that we've seen work. So there were practices such as 15 to complete, because there was the issue that we were trying to resolve nationally around how do we get community college students to complete? Well, they'll complete if they take 15 credit hours a semester. So that's one of the, I would say Guttman solved that, because we require students who were traditional age students to be a part of a cohort, and they're full time. That has contributed to our graduation rates. Something else that was so impressive is that I had faculty who were committed to the model. They were committed to social justice, and they were committed to eliminating barriers and inequities that impact students' ability to be successful. So their partnerships where students receive all of the transportation is covered as a student at Guttman Community College. They also receive, I would say, stipends as they move throughout different milestones from their beginning of their process and their completion. So those are things to me that we really got it right in terms of what are the high impact practices that will help students to remain engaged at the institution, but also help them to be successful. So in thinking about what worked, we know that requiring students to be full-time is working. We know that. We know that the traditional age student are more than likely that works for them. But there's also a population as we look into the future. How can we serve adult students who may have delayed entering college for 3, 4, 5 years? How can we meet the moment of serving them? Many of them may not be displaced because of the pandemic. Jobs, as you mentioned, have changed. So we're now beginning to do an assessment based upon the success of our model, and how can we bring in the adult population who may be 25 years or older? How can we now bring in the transfer students who we do not currently serve? Because again, if students are coming in a cohort and they already have a schedule that's already outlined for a year, well, if a student comes to us in the spring semester and they may already have 8 or 9 12 credit hours, where do they fit within the context and the framework of our model? We are now beginning to assess that, because our goal is to make sure that all students, have access to a robust and a rich education that we provide. And we're also beginning to look at our programs, such as adding more AAS programs to the college curriculum, to ensure that students, once they finish, if they desire to move on to a 4-year college or university, we celebrate that. But we also know that there's a significant number of students who may not be able to afford to continue on the pathway, I would say, into 2 more years without making a family sustaining wage. So in that regard, we're beginning to assess our programs that we can add more resources to make sure that students can complete and that they can be successful. But that's taking work to really evaluate what we call our first year experience. How can we provide students more access to their program level courses in their first year, because that has not been as possible in the past, or not possible in the past. So we're truly looking at the success of the Guttman model and retaining all of the elements of the model that work, but now we're reimagining how do we build and how do we scaffold this model that is successful to now serve students who may want to come part-time, who cannot afford to be full-time. What type of practices do we employ to make sure that they are still completing in record time and they're meeting their own professional and personal goals? So my vision for the college is that we will continue to build upon the strong foundation that we have, but we begin to add programming and resources and innovations that will again mark us as one of the nimble and exciting and research intensive institutions that has allowed us to leverage some of the national attention that we've had over the last 8 or 9 years.
Yeah, and of course, you mentioned that national attention, a number of awards. I think I saw Best Community College in America and some other very notable awards that the college has won. And for a college so young, very notable that Guttman has received so much attention. My last question for you is any final word that you would have for our audience? You mentioned what has been achieved at Guttman, and what you hope to continue to build on as you look towards the future. So many of the leaders who may be listening to this podcast are really struggling. They're really struggling as to what can they do to boost enrollment. How can they convince somebody who is working, so many employers now, we talk about even minimum wages. So wages are rising. Some people will say, hey, I've got this job, and it's enough, right? I'm getting by, but we know, of course, even with a credential, not to mention an associate's degree, the earning potential is tremendous. But so many students are not seeing that as viable or necessary, right? And so many of our community colleges, I think, do struggle with effectively communicating that value proposition. They do struggle with getting students to complete, right? Because we talk about open access being the first mission of the community college, but the completion agenda, we've been talking about that for some time. I was wondering if you might have a last word to many of the community college leaders who are listening to us about, amid all of these headwinds that underrepresented students, Black and Brown students in particular, are experiencing, right? And we haven't even gone into the social headwinds, but it's been just another rocky week. And we know, even with regards to this pandemic, that Black and Brown students have been disproportionately affected, both economically, both in terms of death rates. So many things are happening to the students that we are serving. The challenge is great, and many of our institutions are struggling as to how to reach this population, get them back into college, get them to complete. I was wondering if you could offer any final commentary to our audience, those who are struggling to boost enrollment, to boost completion, specifically for Black and Brown students. What do they need to be paying attention to specifically from your vantage point?
Awesome. So I'll really build upon something you just stated. The challenge is great, but for me, if I can add an addendum, the opportunity is greater. What we have learned in the pandemic is that our students, they can be successful online. So how now do we leverage varied modes of instruction, hybrid, high flex, depending on the nuance and the terminologies that institutions are using? How can we now provide more resources to allow students the flexibility? Because if they have to work, maybe we need to provide different scheduling modalities that will attract more students to the institution who would otherwise not have come, because our schedules were so rigid to the point where they felt they had to be on campus, which would not allow them to work. Number two, I believe it is certainly important and critical that we begin to partner more closely with our community-based organizations, our big brothers, big sisters, our Boys and Girls Club, the university settlement homes, and the different housing authorities and those type of organizations, because they have young people, but they also have persons who are looking to be reskilled, and partnering directly with those organizations to identify what is the need, and then having our faculty and staff and administration to then align curriculum to provide options for those community persons. I think that's also something we need to consider. But we also have to begin to think about, what is working well in terms of our structures, and what do we need to change about our structures? What do we need to change about our academic programs as we're going through the evaluative process, a program of review and assessment, as most institutions do? What type of outcomes are we seeing? What is the placement, job placement? What are the average salary earnings of those organizations? It's now time to begin to think about, does that program, is it still viable? If it's not viable, how can we now reallocate those resources to programs that we know are viable? And we also must begin to think about partnering with our K-12 partners sooner. Oftentimes, we begin working with students in dual enrollment when they're in high school. But I argue that we need to begin to really work and to begin to think about that fifth and sixth grade student who is still yet impressionable. They're still trying to figure out exactly what it is that they desire to do. Because once they get to ninth and 10th grade, oftentimes their minds are made up. So what are ways in which we can create programs where we're getting students on campus in the summer for different bridge programs or camps? It could be technology focused, it could be business focused, it could be healthcare focused, so that that young person, the likelihood that they will now come to a community college or a college or technical college is now increased because they've had some type of engagement. How can we get our students to go to many of those institutions and be mentors to those young people? When I was in St. Louis, we created what was called an adopt a school program, where my students who were Phi Theta Kappa, which were the honor students, we went to the middle schools and we tutored them out to school on different subjects based upon, the administration, the principal's interest. And to me, I think we may not see the short-term gains, but long-term, when those young people are making decisions about going to colleges or to, made to focus on at a community college while they're still in high school, I think that helps to elevate the importance of the role of the community colleges and how students enrolling in those institutions can be supported and can be successful by coming there. And I think we need more investment from our local officials, our elected officials, who really need to understand the value of what the community college has to offer. And, that's one of the things I think is always a struggle. How, can, with the little resources that many of these elected officials have to allocate, how can you make your argument so strong that, you would receive additional dollars? And that's always a struggle. But I think making sure that we're working with those private and public corporations who are willing to even invest are there employees that they would like to reskill, where the community college could be the educational answer to help them scale up their own employees, and they have their own pipeline and they're not using their own. They're trying to teach their own by investing resources when there's a skilled community college that can do that. So those are some of the things I think that we have to think about, and really be intentional about doing it, because there's so many options now that students have. And as community colleges, we have to really do more to amplify the value that we bring as a higher ed institution. And I think that marketing strategy, that strategic communication, all of those things must be leveraged now, as students in many colleges were relaxing entrance, admittance to four-year colleges and universities. So when that happened, quite naturally, you would see a decline at the community colleges, because many of those students now have access to four-year colleges and universities. But when that pendulum shifts, and now, SAT, ACT, and all of those other standardized tests, become, again, that assessment or that evaluative tool to determine if a student is ready, then what happens with those young people in terms of their emotional well-being? Because for a year or two, they were able to go directly into those universities because there was no requirement, right? There were, but there weren't in terms of, standardized testing. So I think there's a lot that we as community college leaders have to think about, but it will take, collective thinking. I think it will take also coming together to dispel of the things that we know no longer work, and not harboring those practices because we've always done it this way as an institution, being risk, taking the calculated risk, because that is the role of the job. You have to be able to make the calculated risks in order to see some type of movement and some type of success. So that's what I would share, as I'm still learning, the role in learning New York City, and I've served at a couple of colleges. But as I look now on, where I've served and the work that I've done, this is probably one of the most challenging times to be a leader, whether it's a faculty member or to be, an administrator, because you're working with a group of students and working with a campus who, for 1 to 2 years was working remote. Now, how do you get people back to work, with that same energy and vigor and morale, that they potentially had before, and now they have to come back to a place. So all of those employee engagement, you have to not only think about the student, but also the health and the welfare of the institution as well. And that's a tall order, but I believe that community colleges are the place where we can certainly meet the moment and be able to really show that, we are viable and we are producing graduates that will really make a contribution and an economic impact in our communities.
Well, Dr. Johnson, I thank you so very much for your time, sharing your perspective with our audience. Thanks so much. I know there's a lot going on in your office, many responsibilities, but I appreciate you taking some time to share with us here on In the Margins. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the invitation, David. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it. All right, take care, Doc. Thank you.
All right.